Yeah, that's what it seems like. It says it's recording, but I don't have any sound.
Good afternoon. Are folks able to hear me now? Allison or Barbara, if you could let me know if you guys can hear me, that would be great.
Now I can hear you. Yes, Sandy, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Sorry about that, you guys. It looks like I had some issues with my audio connection. I sincerely apologize for that. I've been talking away. I did the whole introduction. I teed up the webinar. So I guess we should go ahead and start over. I'll give a high-level overview. So you're joining us for today's webinar. Now that everybody can actually hear me, a couple of quick notes. Just note that you'll be muted for the presentation. If you have a question, please send them in through the chat window, and be sure to select all panelists from the drop-down menu. And I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Barbara Mooney to introduce our speaker, again, now that you guys can hear me. So Barbara, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Sandy. We have a great pleasure today in having Alison Rumler-Gomez from Lincoln, Illinois, to provide us with some information. She comes to the Community Action Network with a varied background of experience, including work as a legal researcher. She was engaged in activities in higher education, including stimulation of development of technical colleges in Tennessee, Mississippi, and across the Midwest. She created the DeSoto Assimilation Center to assist new immigrants to the Mid-South, and consults in the areas of organizational change and executive coaching services, where she provides training and development in the areas of operational efficiency, strategic planning, and business process management. And if all of that isn't enough, since 2014, she's been the Chief Executive Officer for the Community Action Partnership of Central Illinois, and she's also a nationally certified ROMA Implementer. So she comes at this process of implementing ROMA and performance management from a unique perspective, and we're so glad to have you, Alison. I'm going to pass this over to you, and Zandy and I will be watching the chat and Q&A boxes in case anyone has a comment or a question. We'll give you a heads up if we hear anything or we see anything. So take it away, Alison.
Hi.
Okay.
Oh.
There you go. Yes, thank you. Yes, I was thinking we've lost sound again, but yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, hi, everyone. It is so great to be here today. And I'm glad we did the introduction to the chat box, because before I start digging into your belly buttons, that's sort of a personal thing, right? I'd like to have a few of you just type in the chat box your name and where you're from, maybe. I hope my girl, Miss Christine from the Illinois Association, is out there somewhere. She was my fearless Roma teacher here in Illinois. But it makes me feel a lot better, and I'm sure it'll make you feel a lot better if we know each other a little bit better before we start talking about belly buttons. It's, again, sort of a personal deal there. So if you have a minute and you're familiarizing yourself with the technology here, give me your name and where you're from. I'd love to hear a little bit more about you. Right, I am super excited to be here to talk about the belly button rule today. My daughter and I have about a 45-minute drive to school every morning, and I was telling her about the presentation, and we honestly use the, hey, George, nice to see you out there in Pennsylvania, and Maureen, good to see you, South Dakota, wow, everywhere. But we talk about the belly button a lot in my house. In my house, that's sort of a way to scream accountability without screaming accountability. So I carry it over in my personal life, and I'm super excited to share it with you in the network today. So let's go ahead and get started. If we could hit that next slide. Hi, Tony from California. Hey, Christine, my mentor and champion. Love it that she's here today. That's awesome. All right, well, what's the best and fastest way to accountable implementation for those services that I know that you have all worked so hard to build? You did your assessments, you conducted your focus groups, you planned, you developed your outcomes, you identified those indicators, you went through the painstaking process of getting all of that wrapped up. You have measurement tools, you have a place to store your data, and you've evaluated your gaps in your resources, and you've filled them all up, right? So now what? How do we make this stuff really work? That's the big question, right? I know as an executive director here at Community Action Partnership of Central Illinois, community action in general is just a really complicated thing. It's a big umbrella with a lot of things happening underneath that giant umbrella, and it's hard to wrap your mind and your hands around it. So accountability, right? Wait for it. It's the belly button. So here's the funny thing about belly buttons. Belly buttons don't have a formal job title. They don't have an assigned seat at the front desk. They don't have a corner office or an uncomfortable swivel chair at the reception desk. They don't wear a tie. They don't have scrubs. They don't wear Crocs or heels. and they really don't have their own box in the organizational chart. But the belly button is a central player to this ROMA implementation deal. It really is an essential piece for accountability across the board. And let's face it, it's a belly button that makes it cool. So let's go to the next slide. I also want to talk about the ROMA life cycle today for a minute. A life cycle in general is a viewpoint that looks like the whole life of something. It sequences the events for the sake of continuity, but it also gives you a sense of how the big picture fits together. They're usually developmental stages. One builds upon the last, and the belly button really lives in all of these spaces. But process development has a special and close place to my heart, and we're going to spend a lot of the time that we talk about today between the spaces of planning and implementation, because it really does touch the end piece of the planning portion and the beginning of implementation, and then it wraps all the way through that life cycle. But the real question is for me, and I'm sure it is for many of you, how do we really make the leap from that perfect plan to effective implementation? As I went through the ROMA classes myself and then went on to work with other folks with the implementation piece, that seems to be the space that we all really, really struggle with. We've done a great job in the Community Action Network of mastering this assessment piece. We're really good at doing the surveys. We're introducing focus groups. That part we've been really successful with. The strategic plan is really a staple, at least here in Illinois with my peer group. They've gotten really good at doing the strategic plans, about introducing the concepts, about connecting the need with the outcomes and the indicators. But once we get to this phase where we have the perfect plan, we have to figure out how to make it work. So if you've been through the ROMA training, as I've been through the ROMA training, you know that we have to identify those ways that connect the need to the outcome and then to the overarching strategy. We have to know what we plan to do. And those strategies can be a single service or activity, or they can be a series of services and activities and actions that we bundle together. And we all know from experience, right? Christine, I know you're backing me up out there, that when we bundle those services together, we're usually more effective. That sometimes that effectiveness comes when we can wrap those services around our families and around our communities so that we're attacking multiple problems at the same time. I always tell my staff when we get frustrated with our customers and with folks that come in that I don't know how your lives work, but my life never comes with just one problem. When I have a problem, those are multidimensional. They come in all different shapes and sizes and usually come at the same time, unfortunately. And our families are really not a whole lot different than that. So when we bundle those services together, that makes us more effective across the board. And we know that from experience, and we know that from the ROMA training. But what we don't always identify up front is that bundling those services together make us more effective, but it also sometimes makes us more complex. It makes us less friendly to our customers in some situations, and it makes us more complicated to each other. We're less inclined to work agilely as one unit when we have a bunch of little pieces that we can't effectively put together. So one of the things that I love in the ROMA training is when Barbara says that we can't rely on magic as strategy. How true is that? And I'm not going to lie, I'm like you, I'm a normal person that goes through life, and I've executed the prayer and cross your finger strategy more than one time. And I think we all have done that at one point or another. But process, really, really good process, is the way to accomplish successful implementation in those services that we work so very, very hard to build. So I'm going to click on over to the next slide if we could, please. Another tool that should look familiar here with my dancing skeleton, right, is the ROMA logic model. And that's a tool that I absolutely love. It's such a great tool for planning a new service, but it's also great for reviewing and improving services that you've already created and launched. It brings things together. It links program operations together effectively with program accountability. And it really, really makes for the great bones of a service that we need or a program. It's a clear illustration of what you and your organization, what you want to do, why you want to do it, what you want to plan to achieve, and how you're going to measure those achievements in it. It also illustrates how a project or a program or service is understood universally throughout your organization and intended to produce a particular result, right? The goal is to get to the end, and we're projecting super success, and we know exactly what that success looks like with the ROMA logic model. It forces us into it. But ROMA really is exemplified in the ROMA logic model, but what it does is it creates a way of thinking. It isn't just columns and rows to make a matrix, although it's beautiful. I'm one of those people. But it really does give the program or the service bones. It gives us an opportunity to put an emphasis on those results and on those outcomes so that we've got a real effective way to put together a strategy. And that's really what the logic model does for me. It gives those programs and services the support. It creates that support so that the services and programs can be effective. It also gives us a dedicated space to store critical planning information and gives the program or service the flexibility to move and evolve while remaining connected to the planning framework. I talk about it a lot with my staff. We use the ROMA logic model for planning all of our programs and services here at Community Action, but we also use that as a tool to revisit every year during strategic planning. So it gives us an opportunity to drift a little bit and then reconnect with those pieces at least one time a year. For us, we have a every other month board meeting where we present our activities, actions, and outcomes to our board. If you're in the CSBG network, that's probably not unfamiliar territory for you. But what that does is allow us to reconnect to the things that we said we were going to do, and it forces us by way of using that tool to reconnect to those very things. But the ROMA logic model, it's a practical tool for using when we're doing the planning piece, when we're doing the reevaluation, when we're evolving. But it is in some ways a theoretical tool. It doesn't give us the nuts and bolts of who turns here and when does she go there and what do we get when all of that is completed. To make your skeleton really start to dance and to give those bones movement, I feel you need process. So we'll go to the next slide. And as we said earlier today, I'm really going to need your help. All right, so there are a couple of things about me. It's confession time. If Christine were on the audible here, she would probably repeat this because I know how many times I've said it in the multiple trainings I've been to. People who know me well will tell you a couple things up front. First, I'm a bit of a mule. I have been known to have a teeny tiny stubborn streak. And secondly, more applicable for today, is that I cannot cook or bake to save my life, which is why I usually use cooking and baking examples in my process workshops. I figure if my students can make baking and cooking easy to follow and understand for me as they develop their processes, then really anybody can learn from it. I always manage to get great cooking and baking tips after the session too, so feel free to throw those out. Either way, using real world examples of process and using that in baking and cooking usually is a win-win scenario for me. Great tips, and you can make it easy for me. So how do you get to build great process without losing sight of the big picture? Because that's important. That's one of the things that we learn in the ROMA training, is that life cycle gives us a big picture of what we're supposed to be doing. The ROMA logic model gives us a sense of what the big picture is. And it's critical that we never ever lose sight of that big picture. We don't want to lose sight of what great customer service is. We want to stay acutely focused on client-centric service delivery. We want to maintain focus on the outcomes and the results. And all of that is really, really important, but if you don't have a specific, repeatable strategy to make those things happen, it's difficult to get there. But I would like to say that it's easier than you think, right? So in real process world, I'm going to go to my baking scenario here, and I'm going to solicit some of your help. So get your hands ready and your fingers typing, because I'm going to need you to help me out here. But the first thing you do with good process is you chunk up the work and give it a name. Don't overcomplicate it on the first pass. Good process is built iteratively, so don't put any pressure on yourself for it to be perfect the first time around. But you really do have to chunk it up in a way that makes sense, and then you have to give it a name. The second task is really to sequence those tasks in a way that makes sense. And if you could hit my animation there for me, we'll show you how we can make sense of that jumbled mess on the screen there. Okay, so, oops, go back one, there we go. All right, so our procurement of the ingredients, right? We like to use that word procurement. It's big and it makes me feel important, but really that boils down to shopping for us. Preparing my kitchen and my ingredients for a baking project, mixing those ingredients together according to a recipe, baking those cookies in the oven, and then cooling and serving those treats. Now, I'm sure as you're reading through those, I am not a culinary expert, as I have already confessed. That looks like a really good set of instructions to me. My aunt, however, is a cook, and she is a masterful cook. So if I wrote to her that I needed to procure ingredients, that is not nearly enough detail for her, right? She's going to want to know, well, which store are you going to? Here in Lincoln, we have Walmart Supercenter, and we also have Aldi that's got some great organic products. She would have a complete list of everything that needed to be procured from Walmart and that needed to be procured from Aldi, and if we needed to go out of town to get something else. So her itemization of what happens in there probably would be a lot more robust than mine, but at this point, at this stage in the game, we're really not there yet. So procure ingredients is good enough. But sequencing is really important, right? So this is a little bit on the obvious side, but as I said, I'm not a cooking or culinary expert. I'm not sure that I wouldn't prepare the kitchen and ingredients before I went to go shopping, but this is supposed to make sense for you. And that's another really critical piece about sequencing these tasks, is there isn't really a right answer. And that also makes it really important that you work in process in iterative fashion. The first time around, it may make total sense to you that preparing the kitchen and the ingredients should come first, and then you realize, that's a pain. I really needed to figure out what I was going to need to get in terms of ingredients before I went there. So sequence those tasks, but give yourself the latitude to ebb and flow with the changes. And the last piece of this, and this is one of those areas that most people tend to want to go first to, is naming the belly button. And remember, the belly button doesn't have a job title or an assigned seat. It is the magic of the belly button. It's one of the most important elements of good process development. And for organizations to be nimble and effective and result-driven, it really is imperative that the belly button rule is elevated and preserved, and that belly button doesn't get named until very last. So at this point, you have to be thinking, this lady is crazy. Right? What's with the belly button fixation? So the belly button in other circles, more professional circles, is probably known as a process assignment. So if you've attended a business process development workshop at some point, or you use that process development exercise in your organization, it's probably better known to you as a process assignment. I call it the belly button mostly because you can't fix a face to it or a specific person. So a lot of times when you're trying to create great process, we want to have a specific who. Belly buttons are also singular. So we're guilty of doing it in our organization. Every organization I go to and I consult with is also guilty of this, right? You already have a someone in your organization that does some task. And so when you're creating process, you start to build in excuses or exceptions based on the people that you already see filling those positions. That really does close off the creativity that should come with good process development. So when you're building process assignments, these process assignments should look more high level. They should look like descriptors. So if you take the procure ingredients, for example, instead of calling that mom, which is who it would be at my house, there's only one of us. So that always saddles mom with the responsibility of being the shopper for the ingredients. But if you call the shopper, that could mean that dad, Sebastian Gomez, could run to the store today. Or when the 14-year-old finally gets her driver's license, maybe she's the shopper. The prep staff at my house, again, probably still mom. But I have a zealous 7-year-old boy, and he's ready to get started with the kitchen prep, right? So maybe at some point, Emerson could be the prep staff. So the purpose of having these process assignments as opposed to having a specific name or a job title is that it really does give you the latitude to build out information and procedures that are strong enough that someone can just switch hats. So if you've got baker, and hostess, is it feasible that one person could fill all of those posts in this process? Absolutely. And that's really the point of making something efficient through process development, is if you've got clear expectations, inputs and outputs, clear procedural steps within each one of your processes, that it lends itself to allowing multiple people to wear different hats, right? That I don't know how many times we've heard. And I'm 5 years in, so let me throw a caveat in here. I'm 5 years in as the executive director at Community Action Partnership of Central Illinois, and we're just now getting to the place where we do our process development workshops, and people know better than to say, well, that's not really her job, right? This eliminates that. If you've got procedural steps that are outlined in a process assignment or a belly button that's called shopper, it really prohibits us from boxing ourselves into a place where we're only doing those jobs that are very specific to the job description. So I don't know about you guys, but in our job description, the last item and responsibility on every job description is other duties as assigned. And if you've got great process and you've built them properly, that really does lend all of the staff to be in a place where they can contribute to making the organization run better and more efficiently and being more customer-centric. From a customer's perspective, and I know we've all been those customers, when somebody puts us on hold because they can't do that, or that's not really their job, or we get swapped from person to person because this person doesn't do that part of the job, you have to see the next person. It's super frustrating, and it's not customer-centric. So again, using this belly button rule really does make us better organizations. It makes us more efficient, and it makes us more customer-centric from everyone that we serve. So the other deal with the belly button rule is that when it doesn't have a specific who associated with it, and belly buttons are singular, even though many tasks require the belly button to collaborate, right? We don't operate in a vacuum. It doesn't mean that we have one person that does one job. The belly button rule requires that one belly button is accountable for the task and its output and the successful transition, but that can be anybody who's wearing the belly button's hat at that point in time. All right, so we're going to switch slides and talk a little bit more about those inputs and outputs. So there are some really critical pieces to good process that comes even before the step-by-step integration. And before we put the process puzzle together, you do have to have the pieces and you have to identify them. So one of the most important things, and again, I'll relate this back to the critical importance of ROMA, the foundational piece to the ROMA logic model, and where we start at the very beginning of the ROMA training, is to know your why, right? What's the mission statement? The same thing is true when you look at process development. The most important thing you have to do before you begin any of the process development is know why you're building it. What's the purpose? So what is the purpose of the process that you want to develop? And that sounds like a really easy question, but it also sounds like a really easy task to write a mission statement, doesn't it? How many of you thought, oh, we're going to spend an entire chapter working on a mission statement, and then you dig into that ROMA training and you realize without a great why, without the purpose clearly stated, everything else just sort of falls apart, doesn't it? And the same is true with great process development. When you're developing great process, you have to know your why. You have to know what the purpose is of the process that you're developing. Another critical piece is the entry criteria. The entry criteria are the equal and opposites of getting into and out of your process. An entry criteria is an event or an activity, a business trigger that starts the process or the procedure if you're working at the procedure level. And that event or trigger should generate an input. And I know when we first tossed the idea around with Barbara about doing the belly button rule presentation, inputs and outputs have a special place in the ROMA world, but in process development, inputs and outputs are typically something that you can hold in your hand. Developing inputs and outputs and having entry criteria when you develop your process really lends itself to automation. And in your world and in my world, things work a lot more smoothly when we can automate some of our processes. So with the baking example, we're gonna dig into that in a few minutes. When we're talking about what makes something start or what makes something finish and what we get, those inputs and outputs should really be something that you can hold in your hand or that you can look at electronically, but it should be a something. The entry criteria and the exit criteria allow us to seamlessly connect one task to the next task. It's sort of like a chain link fence. So whatever the entry criteria is should have been the exit criteria from the procedure that came before it. So let's go to our next slide here. We're going to talk about my kitchen again, right? So I'm going to talk about procedure number 2. Preparing the kitchen and ingredients. My entry criteria that I've identified here is that the groceries have been loaded up for transport to take home. And my input then would be the something that I can hold, right? It's my bagged groceries. The exit criteria, right, after I've finished the procedure of preparing my kitchen and my ingredients, the after part is the wet and dry ingredients that have been separated. Don't laugh, I had to ask people what that was, right? So that I'm not a cook, but I do know now that the wet and dry ingredients need to be separated out. And then the output is something, again, that I can hold in my hand. It's those separated ingredients. And filling in the steps in between there is really about making that robust. But on your first pass, if you're talking about iterative process development, if you only get this far, this is progress, right? Because you have to decide what it is that makes my procedure start or makes my process start, and what it is that tells me that it's over. And there's a little key in here. It's kind of a trick. When you have the words have been preceding the verb, that tells you that something has been accomplished. So as you're writing your entry criteria and as you're writing your exit criteria, that's a quick and easy way to cheat to get there, right? So I know that something has happened in order to initiate my procedure, and I know that I get something as that has happened. When I close out my procedure or my process, depending on what level I'm developing, something has happened to make that close, and when that has happened, I have something to pass on. So it's audience participation time, and thank you so much. I love that I'm getting all the names here. It's so great to see everyone from Pennsylvania all the way down to Puerto Rico. That's crazy. Hello, how are you? All right, so let's click on to the next slide. Oh, right there, we're good. All right, so it's your turn now to help me out. All right, so audience participation time. If my procedure was that the groceries have been loaded for transport, there should be some things that happen before I have my wet and dry ingredients all separated in my kitchen. So there's no right or wrong answer here, and this is the amazing part about process. Because it's iterative, because there is no right or wrong answer, there's no reason to be afraid of it, right? So we've started this cookie baking process of mine. And I've already been to the grocery store, so the shopper has done his or her job in acquiring the groceries, and they have loaded those groceries ready for transport back to my house. But this procedure that I'm working on is about preparing my kitchen, right? So there should be some steps after my groceries have been loaded for transport, and I have my bagged groceries, and before I have my wet and dry ingredients that have all been separated out nicely in my kitchen. So can you guys throw out a couple of steps that might happen between my groceries have been loaded at the grocery store for transport and my wet and dry ingredients have all been separated nicely in my kitchen? What are some things that we would do between those activities? Don't be shy now. I'm going to count on my girl Christine to type in here.
So you can use either the chat function or the Q&A function. We'll be watching both. I see someone says load the groceries in the car.
Yeah.
Is that a good step?
Yeah, and I also see get my cooking utensils, right? That's great. I love that you guys have more experience in this. Drive home, absolutely. Unload the groceries at home, drive to the kitchen, yes. Put groceries away, you guys are totally getting the hang of this. Absolutely, right? So look at how clear we have when we look at how clear we are when we box this in. If we know that the groceries have been loaded from my car or from the grocery store, ready for transport, and I have to have everything all separated out and ready to go, there are things that have to happen in between. Gather measuring cups, I love it. Yes, that's part of the preparation of the kitchen. And those steps are the steps that you make and you create. But again, process is sort of a tricky thing here, and it does have to happen over time. So, right, when I baked my first set of cookies, I may go, oh, yeah, it was not a great idea. I love that we've got put groceries away because that's totally the way I would do it. I'm a little bit OCD that way, right? So I'd put all my groceries away before and face the cans. Who is that? Yes, Brandy, I'm with you. I put all the groceries away, face my cans, get everything all nice and tidied up, and then I would go back out and pull my ingredients that I just put away back out on the counter. That's one of the things about process, right? You identify those things as you're going through it over and over to go, hey, maybe next time I'll just set the groceries that I need for my cooking aside before I put them away. I love it. Yes, bags on the counter. I have a process expert out there in Sean. I can see that already. Bags on the counter, 1, all items out, 2, clear space for the wet and dry. I love it. Yeah, you guys got it. This is great. All right, so we're going to go and do sort of a real life work scenario. So the cookie baking scenario will only take us so far. And I want you to try this at home. I know it sounds crazy, but don't lie. I know there are some of you out there who have a ROMA logic model on your fridge for something. I've done it myself. I know I'm not alone. So let's click on over to the next slide here. All right, so just like we have in our ROMA training, our ROMA life cycle, and we have our ROMA logic model, there are great tools that you can use in process development that make life easier to follow the process, easier and cleaner for us to take the process to a new level in process development and in the iterations. Again, good process makes all of ROMA life cycle easier. It makes the assessment easier. It makes the planning more iterative. It makes the implementation systematic and clear and very results driven. Results are recorded consistently in outputs and in evaluation, and it's really a natural extension of ROMA and the way that we do ROMA when we're working on processes. So as you can see, this is a real life process that we use at the Community Action Partnership of Central Illinois. And just like there are key components in the ROMA logic model and in the ROMA life cycle, there are things that have to exist in good process development. So you can see at the top that my alignment is really stinky, and that's going to bother me today. I know it will bother some of you out there too, but go with me here. So the department is the Human Resources Department. And with that, we have what's called a process owner. And the process owner is not responsible for all of the activities within the process, but they are responsible for making sure that the process is followed and that when there are issues or problems in the process, that person is really driving those changes. So that process owner is the one who drives out the change and does the monitoring of the process itself. And then the program, this you can see is an organizational level process. And there's really a lot of times 2 different levels. The organizational level process is a process that happens overall under the umbrella for an organization. So things like procurement, like onboarding, probably your payroll management, some of your fiscal functions. Those really happen because they touch everyone within the organization. And then you have service level process that's really developed for those individual services. So this one that we're going to look at today, the human resources process, is our onboarding process, and it is an organizational level process. So I know those are not super easy to read, so we are going to click over to an Excel spreadsheet. So it may take us just a second to transition, but we'll get a better view of our spreadsheet here. Awesome. All right, so this is no fancy tool. This is an Excel worksheet, and the Excel worksheet is something that we use here for our process development. There are other tools out there, so if somebody tells you thou must have Visio in order to do good process development, it's not true. You can do it right here on an Excel spreadsheet just as effectively. So there are other pieces on here that we want to identify. On the left-hand side, in our swim lane diagram, you see those are the belly buttons. So we have in here our Chief Compliance Officer is a belly button. We have a new staff member. We have our human resource folks, right? Those are all individuals that play a part or have a piece in our onboarding process at Community Action. Then there are some ovals on there. Those ovals are the entry criteria and the exit criteria to begin and end the process. So you can see on the first yellow oval there that the employee has been made an offer. So they've received an offer letter from us. And the nice thing about this is that those procedures are clearly defined at a high level on a process flow diagram. But behind each one of those boxes, for those of you that need a deeper dive on what happens within the box, there's a procedural level of detail behind there. But I'll caution you. So again, I want to say we're in year 5 here at Community Action Partnership of Central Illinois. And on day 1, we started talking about good process development. And we're in year 5, and we're just now getting to the point where most of our organizational level processes have the level of detail that comes behind the box. And that, honestly, is about spot on. It takes organizations years to transition from what used to be the standard operating procedure manual. So some of us, we still have some of those that live out in Head Start land, but a standard operating procedure manual was a way that most people did business with procedures. The process flow diagram and doing process development really replaces that way of thinking. It doesn't take away all of the pieces and elements of a standard operating procedure manual, but it reformats it so that it's much more user-friendly. But that takes a very, very long time to get there. And I don't want people to get frustrated when they first jump into the process development space. So let's see, let's look at the Schedule Employees First Day. Can you click on Schedule Employees First Day? Super. So when we go to our procedural level of detail, this is just another tab on the Excel spreadsheet, and it identifies a couple of things in the process hierarchy. So the governing policy, right, this is where the employees would find a very high level understanding of this in the employee handbook, and that policy is really the employee policies. That's the guiding overarching policy that drives the information on here. The principal process is the employee onboarding process, and each one of those little boxes is a procedure, and those procedures also have a name. So the procedure name for this one is Schedule Employees First Day. And you can see, just like at the process level, where we have an entry criteria that makes it start and an exit criteria that makes it end, and an input that lets you know it's time to start and an output to let you know that it is completed. You have that at the procedural level also. So for this particular procedure, the employee has completed all pre-screening requirements, and the input is a completion checklist that we facilitate during the course of that first day. And the exit criteria is that the HR has added a calendar event for the need to knows. And in our situation, the need to knows are the people that are going to be a part of facilitating that process. So the department director, HR, or fiscal officer, benefits manager, folks like that. And then the output, of course, is the calendar invite. And we also have a change in status request. So both of those things, even though you can't hold them in your hand, they are electronic pieces. And if you chose to print them, as some of us do, you take those printed versions and file those. And then just as with the process at the high level, we're defining the purpose, right? So the purpose of this particular procedure is to ensure that the employee is eligible to begin work and that they have completed all the requirements so that they can compliantly get paid from our funding sources. So if you live in CSBG land and you have, say, a foster grandparent program or a Head Start program, they really shouldn't be working unless they've done their background check clearances or they have an MVR to drive. So that purpose is really to make sure that they've got all those things before they venture into the rest of the process. And here's that level of procedural detail. And again, we didn't have these procedural level details drafted until recently. So if you just get to the place where you have a high level process and people understand how to get from one procedure to the next procedure, that's a major accomplishment. Defining those entry criteria and exit criteria and input and output really gives you a sense of how do we transition from one space to the next space. How do I hand off from one belly button to the next belly button? And again, that procedural level detail isn't necessarily super relevant to you, but you can see there doesn't need to be a lot. This one only has 4 steps in it. So we request the employee send a copy of their completed checklist via email, schedule their first day with a staff member, send the Outlook invitations to all the need to knows, and then we have a completed HR change in status form in CAPCIL, which is our database that we collect the information. So all of that, if you want to click back to the big process, all of that lives behind one of those teeny tiny boxes. But again, those boxes don't come easy. That takes a while to get just the high level boxes mapped out. So don't be hard on yourself if it takes a while to get there. The other key component in here, there's a couple more things that you're going to see, is the arrows, right? The arrows really take you from one place to the next. That sequences the events. So we've given the chunks of work names by giving the procedures names, and then we sequence them by putting the arrows to take you from one box to the next. And the last thing that we did before we ever put after we got all the boxes on there, was to assign those names on the side. So remember how we said the belly button comes last? It's a critical piece to it, but the belly button always comes last. You do what makes sense in terms of giving people responsibilities where it makes sense, that don't identify them as specific people unless you absolutely have to identify a specific person for compliance purposes. And the other thing that you're going to notice on here is a decision box. So in process world, we call it happy path, a decision diamond, excuse me. So when we're doing things in a perfect world, right, there isn't any way to ask questions, but it doesn't always go happy path. So there are places and time in the process flow diagram where you have to ask a question. So in this situation, has the team member met all the requirements? So we've already contacted the employee and given them their package. We asked them to complete all the pre-screening requirements. We scheduled their first day, and they do their first visit, and we have some assurance at that point that they've done their pre-screening requirements because we've asked for them to fill out the list. But from a compliance standpoint, we don't want to initiate and start paying folks until we're absolutely certain that they've met all those pre-screening requirements. So there's a check in there, and that's really what the decision diamond does. It makes us pause and ask the question in yes or no form if something has been completed, and that allows it to pass to the next section. So if our happy path is that, of course, our new staff member has followed their pre-screening requirements and they're ready to go, and then we go ahead and facilitate that agency level department orientate, or the agency level orientation with the paperwork. And you can see as we go on through there, through the process flow diagram, that there are multiple pit stops along the way. So at some point, they'll have to visit the fiscal manager. At some point, the operations office, and behind each one of those boxes then is the same thing. You're still going to see that procedural level of detail where you've got the inputs and the outputs, the entry criteria and exit criteria defined. So that seems probably super overwhelming. Let's go back to the slide with the swim lane diagram on it. We can exit the Excel spreadsheet. Beautiful. All right, so good process, again, really is dependent on clarity. And the thing that I love about the swim lane diagram, much like the ROMA logic model, is it's a great visual representation. One of the things that we talked about with our staff very early on, because we have a lot of folks that like a lot of detail when they're putting this information in, is that we're really looking for an 80-20 rule here. If we can meet 80% of the need, then we'll forego the 20% that aren't the happy path version of that. And let's click on to the next slide. We're gonna wrap it up. Who told me they cry that they have to cook? Oh yes, I'm with you there. I'm with you there. All right, on this last slide, let's go to the last one here. Doing process right has countless virtues, and this all wraps very nicely back into the idea of ROMA and ROMA training and why do we do it. So in the early stages of my ROMA days, I was cheering out loud and quietly that our social service agencies were, and human service agencies, particularly CSBG, were really engaged in good planning and in good accountability management, because it's absent in a lot of places in the business world and in the human services sector. But doing process right has lots and lots of virtues. In addition to it giving clear expectation, it also helps with succession planning. I don't know how many of you have folks out there who are the only one who know how to do a particular job or task. If you've got great process and you've got great process flow maps, succession planning is super easy. People should be able to go in with ease and pick up where the last person left off. It helps us to prioritize our tasks effectively. It improves efficiencies or takes away the inefficiencies that live out there. It also creates an overall accountability culture. There's no way to get around accountability if you have those entry criteria, exit criteria, and inputs and outputs clearly defined. And it does build in performance measures. So we didn't get to it because this is really a 400 level class when we start talking about performance measures. But one of the things that we do here at Community Action, now that we've been through this for 4 or 5 years, is that we're able to build key performance indicators into everyone's job description based on the role or the belly buttons that they play in those process flow diagrams. So if I'm an HR manager and I know it's really important to have someone through an onboarding process within 1 business day, I can create those accountability measures just by looking at those procedures and measuring the inputs and outputs. And it also helps us meet the funding and compliance requirements. So I know we're going to leave a few minutes for questions here at the end of the hour, but I do want to say that this seems daunting. I think it seems easy when you're talking about cookies, but when you start applying it to your own onboarding processes or your own intake processes, it seems much more complicated. But I just want to encourage you, I really do feel, I'm a firm believer in this, that some of the struggles that we go through as human service agencies and providers is getting to that place where we have these great, fantastic, wonderful, big ideas and making them work in real life. And I wholly believe that process development, good process development, is the path to get there. So I'm so appreciative of Barbara and of Courtney and everyone who helped make the presentation happen. It was sort of a long haul, and I'm very, very grateful. And I do want to open it up to questions here in the last few minutes, but thank you all so much for attending our session today.
Thank you so much, Alison. The one question we always get the question, where are the PowerPoints going to be? Are we going to be able to get a copy of the spreadsheet and all of those kinds of questions? And yes, those will be posted. They'll be available. This session has been recorded, and that will be posted. There was a question about a sample for the spreadsheet. And I think you walked through a particular process, that of a new employee. I'm assuming that will be good. Georgia, did you think a different kind of sample might be needed? Just type that in. So. And then improving customer service is one question. I don't know, have you done any work with customer service, Allison?
Customer service is sort of hardwired into all of our process development, but we do surveys at the end of each engagement with our intake staff, and then we also incorporate customer satisfaction into our community assessment. So there are several questions on our community assessment each year to ask about that.
Okay, great, thank you. And Georgia says the one example that you gave was perfect, so once she actually has in her hands the spreadsheet itself, then she'll be able to share it with her coworkers, so that's great. And I don't see any other questions right at the moment. I think we're just at our hour here. So I don't see anything else. Did you have any closing comments, Allison?
I think I know that when I see one of the comments in here that this type of process mapping and planning for meeting requirements is what's missing with community action agencies. I feel like that was one of the discussions we had early on that I absolutely agree. I think that's where we all really struggle, is how do we transition our great ideas and our well-defined outcomes and indicators into making it work. So I know that sometimes the process flow diagram is a little bit overwhelming, but there are multiple phases to get there. So I don't want anyone to be discouraged if this looks overly complicated or too hard. There are lots and lots of great process developers out there that can be really helpful when it comes to this, but don't be scared off by the tools or how daunting the task seems, because it is all really, really worth the time.
And we do have an example. We did a kickoff on the 30th that's recorded about implementing ROMA, and there's an example in there about thinking about the fact that maybe we collect information about the outputs in our agency, but not about the outcomes, and it goes step by step to think about, well, what is it that the person does now? What does the worker do with the customer? And where could an intervention happen to give some additional focus on outcomes? So there's that example in that other piece of material that's posted from on the partnership's website. Okay, so I'm now going to turn this over to Zandy, who's going to give us some information about resources that are available from the partnership and some other good information.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks again, Allison, for walking us through that very detailed presentation. I always love a good analogy, and I really like food. So it was really engaging, at least for me, that most of your analogies centered around food. But we really appreciate your presentation and your insight on just a different way to approach process management. Again, I totally agree with the comment that a lot more of this work is needed in our network, particularly as we plan around ROMA and ROMA Next Generation and all of the different reporting pieces, that just taking the time to map things out is very important. So thanks again for walking us through that today. Just to inform you all of a couple of other opportunities to engage with us here at the partnership. We really appreciate you guys joining us for today's webinar. If you would like to join us for our future series, just know that every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we host similar webinar events featuring members of the network or nationally recognized experts talking about various innovative practices that are relevant and important to community action. So here you can see our fall kind of going into winter webinar schedule. We're going to hit a bunch of different topics, but our next webinar that's coming up is actually going to be on October 30th, and that is going to be about applying a racial equity lens to a whole family approach. Our next webinar is going to be on November 20th. That is going to talk about the details of braiding and blending funding streams to actually provide an integrated whole family approach. December 4th is going to be hearing from actually a practitioner out in the field. They have been engaging in a whole family approach with us over the last couple of years, and they actually got some external consultation to get a 2-gen evaluation report on the results of their pilot over the course of the last 2 years. So they're going to be joining us and sharing out some insights that they've gained over the course of their work, and also some lessons learned for folks who are interested in pursuing a whole family approach. And then last, coming up on December 18th, we are going to be hearing from another practitioner out in the field, heading up a collaborative out in California that is doing some really innovative work around food as medicine and thinking about how to approach social determinants of health with food kind of at the center. So kind of still on theme with a lot of what we talked about today, so more things about food. But there you can see our webinar schedule. If you are interested in joining us for any of those events, you can click on the link there. You can also go to our website and you go to upcoming events. From that drop-down menu, you can see our upcoming webinars and you can find the access and registration information there. If you liked a lot of what we talked about today and you actually want to take steps to operationalize it and learn more about it, please be sure to check out our offerings on Community Action Academy. So there we have free on-demand courses, resources, and videos that are available to folks out in the network completely free of charge. You can access that in a couple of different ways. You can do that online by visiting the link that you see here on the screen. And we also are excited to announce that we have a mobile app for Community Action Academy. So you can access all of that on-demand learning on the go on your phone. So be sure to check that out. We have an array of topics from more nuances related to Roma to some of the innovative practices that we have been identifying and engaging with on our Learning Communities Resource Center project. So be sure to check that out. There's more information on this. Continuing in the conversation today, we actually have a new course on getting into the weeds of how to implement Roma effectively within your organization. So be sure to check that out if you're interested in learning more. Shameless plug for our upcoming conference, our Management and Leadership Training Conference that's going to be taking place January 8th through 10th in San Juan, Puerto Rico. We are very excited for this event, and we hope to see many of you there joining us, if not just for the location, for an opportunity to learn and engage around the different ways that community action can serve as bridges to opportunities in our communities across the United States. And you can find registration information on our website. So we hope to see many of you guys there. And here is the contact information for the folks that were involved in coordinating today's webinar event. You see Courtney's email address up there. She actually helped to gather and get together the presentation for today. So if you have questions on any of the specifics, please feel free to reach out to her. And of course, you see Barbara and Alison there. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of the folks that you see here on the screen with questions, comments, concerns, and follow-up. So with that, that is actually going to conclude today's webinar presentation. We want to thank you all so much for joining us. Again, we want to thank Alison for that wonderful and engaging presentation. And we hope to see you guys at our future training events. Thanks so much and have a great day.